Elisabeth Sabaditsch-Wolff. This is very interesting. So you have a book coming out finally, of which I'm sure a lot of
Yes.
people are going to be really pleased to hear it, especially given that your history, recent history with your conviction in an Austrian court, maybe one of the most important freedom of speech cases in modern history, I have to say, since the Enlightenment possibly. So we'll get into that in a minute. But I had a quick look at some of the material from your upcoming book, and I see that you were in Iran at the time of the revolution. How old were you at that time?
I was 6 years when my parents arrived in Iran, and seven and a half when the Islamic Revolution began in earnest. And I describe in my book how the revolution changed Iran from a fairly secular country almost overnight into a theocratic society.
So you're very, very young, so you're forgiven in advance if you can't answer the following questions. But they're questions that really fascinate me. As I understand it, the revolution in Iran was actually instigated by a communist insurgency, and much to their, I guess, disappointment, that instead of getting their communist paradise, they got an Islamic paradise. And can you describe how that looked? Like during the revolution, who was in the streets, what were they saying and doing? And then when the Ayatollah arrived and how the mood changed. And I believe they even had an equivalent of a night of long knives when the Ayatollahs and the mullahs took care of the communists. Just tell me what you can remember.
Well, I mean, I obviously, I was 6 or 7 years old at the time, and I was busy kind of growing up and still going to school once in a while when schools were open at the time. But I do remember the change in the streets, of course, the streets that were all of a sudden filled with thousands and thousands of black-clad women. And that frightened me. And I describe in the book how to this day I'm afraid of large crowds. I stay away from concerts, music concerts, of large bands. I just don't feel comfortable in large crowds. So that was the first thing I noticed. The second thing I noticed is how my parents would discuss the disappearance of friends, acquaintances. All of a sudden, some of them left the country, others were imprisoned, and that is also something that usually a 7-year-old nowadays, at least, doesn't really hear all the time. Only later did I read up on all the historical background. I read historical accounts actually it was an autobiography of one of the prime ministers who was a communist. And of course, you are right that it was at first a communist revolution, and then of course the communist revolution was basically eaten up by the Islamic theocratic revolution, and then all of a sudden the communists found themselves being rounded up and either killed, or if not killed, then at least thrown into the famous or infamous even Evin prison in Tehran. So hardly any communists left. Most of the communists who survived what you called the Night of the Long Knives emigrated, and these communist Iranians can be found as ex-Muslims in Germany and the United Kingdom, where they do not want to associate with people like me. In that sense, they're still very communist because I'm everything but a communist.
Actually, I think one of the movements that's quite influential in England, I think, is that Hope Not Hate, is led by an Iranian communist. Although I think she's probably too young to have been part of that pre-revolutionary communist movement. but I think it's Hope Not Hate. Miriam Namazi. Maybe I'm bad with
No, it's
names.
not Hope Not Hate. It's not Hope Not Hate. This is the ex-Muslim Council of no, One Law for All.
Oh, One Law for All.
That's
That's
the
right.
group.
Yeah, but if I recall properly, yeah, she's an example of an
Yes,
expat
she is. She's communist.
Iranian communist. Yeah, that's it. Although Hope
Yep.
Not Hate is most certainly also communist, but separate issue. Now let's leap forward. Geez, where do we start the story? I think I'd like to start it in the middle and work our way both backwards and forwards. The middle of the story, I think, would be your first conviction by a judge in Austria because you had said something, I think, now correct me if I've got anything wrong, point form, you accurately said that Mohammed was by modern standards a pedophile, and because they encouraged adult, even middle-aged Muslim males to take on 6-year-old brides, and Mohammed was quite fond of that. And you were convicted, and I think the judge's reasoning was because he stayed with her till she was over 18, he technically wasn't a pedophile, and so you were guilty of a crime by saying that he was. Now, I have to say, even from the point of view of tortured sort of Hegelian reasoning, that still should win some kind of an award. Can you tell us, can you know what I mean? Can you go ahead and describe that situation a little?
Well,
Start out maybe with the classes you gave.
well, I was asked by the Freedom Party when nobody else did back in 2008 and 2009 to give classes, seminars really, to teach people what Islam is all about, what the Quran says, what the Hadith are, the life of Muhammad, and the effect Islam has on a non-Muslim society. My seminars, my PowerPoint presentations were fully sourced. Now, what got me into trouble was a young journalist who infiltrated one of my seminars. Actually, I think she infiltrated all three of them, so she had to endure 12 hours of what would probably be considered hate speech nowadays. And she sent the transcript to a lawyer, and the lawyer then pressed charges. Actually sent the transcript to the authorities, and the authorities then pressed charges. Now, what ultimately got me in trouble, I mean, everything got me in trouble. At first, the prosecutor wanted me to face charges on everything I said, even my words. This was totally ridiculous. The prosecutor did not like me saying that for Austria, I do not want a theocratic society, but a democratic free society. This is what I was aiming. This is what I was aiming for. This is what I am defending. I do not want a theocratic society, but I want a democratic society. That, of course, was thrown out during the court proceedings. What got me in trouble ultimately was a sort of a side discussion that I had with the group of people that I was teaching, lecturing. And we talked about the conduct of Muhammad and how it is exemplary according to Quran, if I remember 33:21, that Muslims have in Muhammad the perfect example of life, of how to act, how to live. And in this case, I said, I asked a rhetorical question. I said, what do we call Muhammad's behavior, i.e., marrying a 6-year-old and consummating the marriage when she was 9, if not pedophilia? So I wasn't saying, I never uttered the words, Muhammad is a pedophile. I knew that would get me into trouble. So I said, desperate for another word, what do we call it if we can't use the word pedophilia? So saying these words was deemed an excess of opinion. There is no doubt, according to the Austrian court, that Muhammad married a 6-year-old and consummated the marriage when she was 9, but I am not allowed to call a spade a spade. This behavior must not be named for what it is. That's what the court said.
So this is where I have to cut in and say, I had a conversation with a Canadian lawyer a couple of years ago who I know fairly well, and he said to me that in a democracy, truth is always an absolute defense. What do you say to that?
No, it's not. I mean, I'm the perfect example. The truth is not a defense, not an absolute defense, no defense at all. That's why my book is called "The Truth Is No Defense." And let me also remind you that a few years ago in Vienna, during the security days of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, my colleagues and I were told by OSCE representatives that the truth can constitute hate speech. We have this, they said it out loud that the truth can be seen as can constitute hate speech. So what is truth really? I mean, is 1 + 1 still 2, or is that hate speech too? So
well, now we're moving deep into Marxist philosophy where 1 and 1 not only cannot be 2 but must be 3.
Yeah,
and although some mathematicians would say for very high values of 1, but in any case, yes. So we have it now that in Austria, truth is no defense because the truth of your statement was not denied, but that you simply couldn't say that essentially because I don't think they called it a blasphemy, but ultimately it was the question was blasphemy, right? So what led up to this decision then was that you were giving courses on Islam to Austrians in order to understand what the new influence on your society was. Would that be fair?
Correct. That's exactly what it was. And like I said, at the time, in 2008, before the Great Migration began in 2015, there were very few people who understood what we were facing, who saw, or as Stephen Coughlin likes to call it, who had been red-pilled, like I have, like you have. There were a few people who saw what was going on and didn't deny it. But it took another 10 years for us, or fewer years until 2015, for us to see the consequences of what was already happening in 2007, 2008. Because remember, the problem with Muslim immigration did not start in 2015. It goes all the way back to the Bosnian War in the 1990s. That's when it really started. The Great Migration into Europe, into Austria, into Germany, into Switzerland began back in the 1990s during the Bosnian War.
So let's just move forward from that first conviction. What year was that in? With that first judge?
The first conviction was in 2010.
2010. Okay, so you appealed that, I'm guessing.
Yes.
And did you appeal?
2011. February 2011.
Okay, and what? Now you appealed that to a higher Austrian court. Would that be right?
Yes, correct. I've appealed to a higher Austrian court, and then even all the way up to the Supreme Court. And
in Austria, this is in
Austria.
So that's two appeals. One to one court, and did they give you a judgment with a reasoning, or did they just decline to?
No. I always got judgments with reasoning, and one was more ludicrous than the other. I mean, the first court said, "Well, you can't say that Muhammad was a pedophile because he stayed with Aisha stayed with him until he died, and she was 18 at the time, so therefore it's not pedophilia." The appellate court, exactly, she really didn't, and the appellate court. Then argued that what I said was a value judgment, and it was an excessive value judgment, so I couldn't say that. So
but of course,
I was still convicted.
Their opinion of your opinion is not an excessive opinion, which I find that to be kind of selective. But in any case, so please continue.
Yes. And then my lawyer and I appealed to the Supreme Court. Forgive me if I don't remember their crazy reasoning, but the Supreme Court, I think, was already looking to the European Court of Human Rights, and it was already, if I remember correctly, balancing my right to free speech with the right of freedom of religion. So that sort of set the stage already for us to go to the Supreme Court, to the European Court of Human Rights, because you have to understand, you can't petition the European Court of Human Rights unless you've exhausted all legal options in your own country.
Okay, so after you went to the Supreme Court in Austria, who gave you some bit of ludicrous reasoning that upheld the initial judgment, which it's just mind-boggling, really, and frankly, very disturbing. And so then you fought this. You actually made it to the European Court of Human Rights, which, on the face of it, is, has to be a contradiction in terms based on every human rights court I'm aware of in Canada or the United Nations. I think Iran and Saudi Arabia are on the human rights commissions in the United Nations.
Yes, but you have to understand that the European Court of Human Rights has nothing to do with the United Nations. This is completely separate. This is a European court, and it was established not by the European Union, but by the European Council. And if you look up the countries that are members of the European Council, you will find that such freedom-loving nations as Azerbaijan are member states of the European Council. I can tell you that because one of the judges on the panel that brought the judgment forth of my final judgment, actually, was a judge from Azerbaijan. So you can imagine that I never had a chance. However, when we petitioned the European Court of Human Rights back in 2012 and 2013, we did believe that we had a chance because the European Court of Human Rights was always in favor of freedom of speech. It was protective of freedom of speech. Up until my judgment, it was always defending freedom of speech, and it was not narrowing the corridor, but it was widening the corridor of what is accepted speech. Now,
interesting.
Go ahead.
What are you aware of any other judgments since then that the European Court of Human Rights has given that indicated direction that court's taking?
Wow, you're asking somebody who is not a lawyer nor a legal mind. I do know that there is one scholarly journal article where cases similar to mine were compared, and I would have to look it up. It was written, incidentally, by a Polish woman, a Polish legal scholar, I think. I'm not aware that this is the case, but if I may direct readers, interested listeners and viewers of your interview to my upcoming book, because there is an analysis of all the legal matters or legal analyses that followed my case. So if any of you are interested, please just wait for the book to be published in September, so next month. You will find an extensive analysis of that.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. I just can't stress enough how important I think the work you've done and the things that have happened to you as a consequence of that work is to people that need to understand. Because I think that the vast majority of intelligent and rational people in the Western world still don't get how our legal systems have been hijacked and perverted to reflect very medieval and theocratic and frankly communist standards, and really don't work on the basis of a secular democracy anymore. I think that's true at many levels of court in many countries now, and it's very, very important. I think your case exemplifies it so well, which is why that the nature of the judgment, which was so clearly fabricated. In other words, that first judgment against you in Austria, where they said because Mohammed was still with her when she was over 18 means he wasn't a pedophile, is fabricated in order to pass a blasphemy judgment, and it had nothing to do with what that judge had said, and that every court upheld it when every court would have looked at the reasoning and said, this is ludicrous. It's so important, and I can't thank you enough for the work you've done. Elisabeth Sabaditsch-Wolff, I look forward to reading your book when it comes out, and I think everybody else should be getting it. Who's publishing it, and where will they be able to get it?
It's New English Review, the publisher, and it will be available on Amazon. It will be hardcover, softcover, ebook, and and even audio. I mean, people have no excuse not to know about what happened to me, and I really would like to. I would like for people to remember that this case was not about me. Never was. It was about all of us. It concerns all of us, and I think that's a very important message. Please don't think that this is about me. And there's so many others who are suffering in Europe, who are actually going to jail for their freedom of speech. I just chose the road down to the European Court of Human Rights, but we must not remember that there's so many other brave people in Europe, in Canada, in the United States, who are fighting for our right to freedom of speech. And I really want to thank you for taking the time to listen to me. You've been a great supporter in the past decade, and thank you for having me again.